I thought we would start by just asking you to talk a bit about your own musical background, the influences you had when you were growing up. Your father, of course, was a very gifted organist and composer, and you've just been celebrating his 100th anniversary last month, I believe.
That's right. My father at the time was, when I was born, had virtually stopped composing, but he would, of course, practice the organ a lot. In fact, he had this extraordinary upright piano fitted with organ pedals. I've never seen anything quite like that before or since. But my main memory, I suppose, was that we were in this block of flats in London, and it was just incredibly noisy. From every room, there would be different sounds coming out. You know, my mother also taught young children the piano. As it got noisier as I got older. We had John Lill became our lodger, as did Tim Rice, and of course, who would play his massive record collection all day long. And of course, my brother writing musicals. So
was it a very big flat? How did you fit all these people in?
It was a kind of strange, rambling flat, yes, but it was also quite concentrated, so you could certainly hear everything that was going on.
But your parents both taught music in different ways. Did they teach you and Andrew, your brother?
Yes, I mean, well, they tried. I think what's interesting listening to the principal of the Leeds College, I mean, we're talking about 21st century, of course, at that point, I was hearing all kinds of different music from the very, very beginning. There were lots of different types of musicians who seemed to drop in and out of the place, and so I was very aware of different kinds of music from the beginning.
And you went to a mainstream school, you didn't go to a specialist music school. No. Do you think that was a good thing, that you were mixing with boys who weren't in the least bit interested in music?
Well, when I say that in my school, the music teacher was also the gym teacher. Maybe that gives you an idea.
Very rare.
Maybe we can talk about that music education aspect later. But I don't know. I think there's a lot to be said for the specialist music schools, particularly if you really believe that you can possibly have a career as a soloist, because one thing I found, you know, when I went to the Royal College, was that the students coming in from, say, Menuhin School, Chet's, you know, were at a higher technical standard. Yes. I mean, they're bound to be. They were practicing far more than if you were just at an ordinary school. Some of them went on to get even better. But what I did find was that there was a catching up that did take place. Yeah. And it was only if they really, really wanted to do it that you saw the specialist school pupils improve.
Yes. But did you come to the cello quite late?
No, not at all. My mother, as I said, she was a specialist teacher of young children at the piano, and so obviously had a try with me, and it didn't work. I was taken to one of those Ernest Reed children's concerts.
Oh,
they
but
used
quite
to have
young, I thought that was
at the
in your
festival
teens.
hall. Yeah,
Right.
I was about 4, and I spotted the cello there. I thought it looked an interesting instrument to play.
What do you think appealed to you about it?
The look of it, really. I think I've always thought it's a very natural-looking instrument. You can see how the sounds are produced and the notes are made and all the rest of it. Whereas if I look at an oboe or clarinet, I'm completely puzzled as to what happens.
So who did they find to teach you when you were that age?
I went to a lovely lady called Alison Dalrymple, and she was like my mother with the piano. She specialised in young cellists, and she also taught Jacqueline Dupre.
Oh, really? Right. So you and then you went on to the Junior Royal College first?
Junior Royal College, yes.
Then the Royal College
when I think I was about 8, 9, I went to the Junior Royal College. As you say, I went to a normal school and left that school at 16 after O-levels.
Right.
But I'd already got more and more into the cello. You know, when I was about 13, lots of things happened at the same time. I changed to a fantastic teacher, which I think just shows how important the relationship between teachers and pupils.
Yes, indeed. And who was that?
Douglas Cameron.
Right. And what was particularly good about him when you were a young teenage boy?
Well, where do I start with Douglas Cameron? You had to be careful what time the lessons were. Because if you came after about 11 in the morning, there would be a certain amount of inebriation. And I mean, it just shows how things have changed.
Yeah, you
because
can't imagine that now, can you?
Well, it was at home. You know, I used to go to his home, as a lot of his pupils did, and he would literally sit there, you know, saying, with a glass of whiskey.
And a cigarette maybe as well?
And a cigarette. And he would take his cello, or my cello, and demonstrate with his cigarette ash dropping all over it. Gosh. So it shows how old I am, doesn't it?
Things have changed for the better.
But I mean, he was a wonderful teacher. His wife was also a cellist and a teacher, and you could see that their whole lives were really planned around the cello, you know. And he was one of those teachers which I always liked, who tried to get the best out of each individual student, rather than saying you have to play it this way. Yeah. In fact, there was a very good instance of the proof of that when Tortelier came to judge a cello competition at the Academy and said, you know, who do all these cellists learn with? Thinking they were all from different teachers because they played so differently, and they were all Cameron's pupils. So he was amazed by that, because Tortelier used to tell you exactly how.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. So you had very much your own musical life in this house that was crowded with other people's musical lives, with keyboards, with your brother composing, presumably, or even at that stage, and you had your cello world that was separate from that.
I would shut myself away in my bedroom actually and practice the cello.
Yes. And getting quiet moments when you could. But did your parents encourage you? Were they interested in what you were doing?
Yes, my mother particularly, they were. I mean, they weren't pushy. I mean, occasionally my mother would say, look, you really should be doing some practice, but that's about as far as it went. You know, they were not too pushy, and I think that they felt that they would encourage, but that if I didn't want to do it...
yes, I think you said somewhere else that it's important for children to learn an instrument that they like and that they want to play. And one of the problems with some of the schemes that are going on here at the moment is that they are told this is the instrument that's on offer in this school this term, you will play it.
Yeah, I do think that's a mistake.
But choosing an instrument that suits the child.
I mean, it might be interesting for someone to you know, play an instrument that perhaps they didn't want to, but I think that different instruments definitely suit different people, so I think that they should be allowed to choose, really.
Yes. Then you went on to study with Pierre Fournier.
I did, eventually, yes, after leaving the
once
you
graduated, yes. Yeah. And did you go to Switzerland, for that?
I did, yeah. A wonderful man, extraordinary man, really. He had disability, he had severe polio when he was very young, so always was, he had I think a completely hip replacement or something. Really? I know he used to, after he played, he used to sort of click this thing back into place. And I just think now, you know, with the demands on soloists, how difficult it must have been for him travelling around. Yes. I mean, he couldn't carry his own cello onto the stage. No. Somebody always had to do it for him.
Yes, extraordinary. But obviously he inspired you with his playing.
Very much.
And with particular repertoire, was he particularly gifted? Did he introduce you to particular composers?
Well, there were works I particularly wanted to study with him, but I wasn't with him for that long, but he was incredibly concentrated. He would want you to bring to a 1-hour lesson a new concerto every time. So you really had to work, you know. Yeah. And so I studied lots of different things with him. The one I most remember was the Lalo concerto, because I really loved the way he played that, and so I was determined to take that to him. Yes,
and you're also very much inspired by Rostropovich, weren't you?
Very much.
And how different was he?
Totally different kind of player. I mean, I just felt Rostropovich was the most remarkable cellist I've ever seen, and still would hold to that. I was lucky enough to interview him at one point for Daily Telegraph, quite a big interview, and I kind of threw him from the beginning because I knew so much about him, and I did even more research, you know, everything I could find out about him, and I noticed that in virtually every single interview he talked solely about his relationships with Britain and Shostakovich and Prokofiev. So my first thing I said to him was, you know, I'm not going to ask you one single question about Britain, Prokofiev or Shostakovich. He said, oh, as if like there was nothing to talk about. So my first question was to him was, you've been married for 50 years to Galina Wisniewska. What's your secret to being married for 50 years? and he was just he was so funny. I mean, he was a wonderful man. Yeah. And why I started on this rambling answer was because I would sometimes watch Rostropovich do technical things that, you know, as a quite advanced cellist at that point, I couldn't quite understand how he'd done them.
Yes.
And I asked him this question. I said, and do you know his reply? Nor could I. But that's
it's just
quite
a magic that happens at the moment.
There was something almost supernatural about it, really. And I was very intrigued to get that reply.
Indeed, I'm sure. It's quite easy for us to forget that you've actually championed a lot of new music, haven't you? And actually a lot of concertos have been written for you.
Well, partly that was his example. I mean, it's something I would like to have done more of, but on the other hand, you have to approach composers you like and that are free to do it and that you really believe can write something, you know, that's going to work for cello. I mean, I had pieces by Philip Glass, which was, I think, a very good concerto. Rodrigo, which was extraordinary at the time because he was 80 and I was like 20-something. Yes. And he agreed to do it, you know, which was great. And Malcolm Arnold wrote me there's one particularly good solo piece that he wrote. I mean, it's something that I think soloists should do.
Yes.
I think, you know, music should be, classical music, if it's going to survive, has to be living. It can't just be a museum piece. I think that's really important.
But it's quite interesting because although you're saying that and you have commissioned and been responsible for the commissions of quite a lot of new music, but you've also been quite outspoken in your views about some contemporary music and how in the 60s and 70s, perhaps even before that, it did tend to alienate the general public, and some composers were really shutting themselves off in a bit of an ivory tower and not connecting
I never
with
criticised
their audience.
any composers. What I criticised was a time and a period in which it seemed to be possible to be, you were only allowed to write in one style. And if you didn't do that, you were history, and it was kind of valueless.
Which of course had a very personal thing for you because you felt that's what happened to your father to some extent.
I think to some extent, yes. But I think things have, thank God, are much, much better now. Yeah. And they have been for some time. I don't think the critics or the audience, even the contemporary music audience, will prejudge a piece just because it doesn't sound like Stockhausen.
Indeed.
You know?
No.
And in fact, I mean, of course there should be room for composers like Stockhausen.
Yes, but within a palette.
John Cage, of course there should be. But that shouldn't be the only way you're permitted to write. Otherwise you get rubbished.
Yes, it's the cultural world shouldn't be so prescriptive as it was in the middle of the 20th century.
And I think things have got a lot better. And I think they had to. Because, you know, as I said, we have to have new music coming through. And if it's a kind of dead cert that 99.5% of the audience aren't going to like it at all, you can't go on like that.
Yeah, indeed. But you, of course, have got a great love for and affinity with British music, particularly Elgar. Would you like to say a bit about that and the composers that particularly mean a lot to you and why?
I think when I was really getting into the cello, when I was 11, 12, I would tape everything off the radio that I could. I've still got all these old reel-to-reel tapes of incredible performances, actually. And I was fascinated not just by the instrument, but in the music written for it, and how there were some really, really good pieces out there that didn't seem to get played. And I found that a lot of them were by British composers. At that point, for example, the Delius Concerto had never been recorded. The Walton Concerto was hardly ever played. The Britten Cello Symphony hadn't yet been composed. But I found a lot of sonatas as well that my teachers introduced me to. Douglas Cameron was very into that British music too, and so I learnt Delius Sonata, the John Ireland Sonata, which is a really, really fine piece. And the Britten works for cello, of course. But I just found, and I liked them. I mean, there's a lot of British cello music I wouldn't play. It has to be because you really like it.
Of course.
And I mean, there's other neglected cello concertos, which I have played and recorded, like the wonderful one by Miaskovsky, beautiful, beautiful work. And the Honegger concerto is a really good piece. I mean, I wouldn't say that it was a kind of British thing in particular. It's just that it so happened that there were a lot of good pieces that were very little known.
And how do you feel as British music travels? You do a lot of touring. How is it received by audiences around the world?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Good question. It seems that generally, particularly Elgar, is received best in English-speaking countries. Now, why that should be, I don't know. You try playing Elgar Cello Concerto in Germany or France, and the orchestra won't know it. You come to the rehearsal, and the only section that knows it are the cello section.
Yeah.
So you get wrong entry people. It's incredible. Any orchestra you play within this country knows every note of it.
Of course.
But that's a strange one. But I have played some of the works I mentioned. For example, I did a concert in Brazil, one of my early concerts there. I played a program of Debussy, Ireland, and Rachmaninoff. And many people really liked the Ireland and said it just as fine a piece as Debussy, which is great. That, I always like that.
Absolutely. So there you are, you've got your international career, which has been going on for years. You're perfectly content, and suddenly you get involved in music education. And we'll go on to talk about the Sistema-inspired work that you're doing with In Harmony. But actually, it originates before that, because you were one of the first musicians to go and knock on the door of Downing Street in the late 90s, I think, the 1990s, when even the 80s.
When we went in there, it was 2003, I think, or 2002.
Yeah, with Evelyn Glennie and James Galway and Michael Carman. And you were really very much instrumental in getting the first stirrings of interest from the Labour government, weren't you, that led through the Music Manifesto to eventually the music plan that we have at the moment. Now, why did you get involved in that? Why did you think that was important to do?
We all felt there had been a lot of musicians at that point, I think, felt that it just had got to the worst level ever, that there were really schools where there was no music at all, and there had been cuts, and there was no money going into the system at all. So we went to see Charles Clarke, who was Education Secretary. I mean, at least he opened the door to us, but I mean, we were making quite a lot of noise as well.
We were, yes, indeed.
And David Miliband was his number two then.
Whose wife, of course, the violinist.
Yes, and Clarke, the first thing he said to us was, we know there's a problem. So at least they recognised that from the beginning. And he sort of said, well, what should we be doing about it? And we all said, put some more money into it, and children have a right to learn music, all the things that we believed. And Clarke sent Miliband away, in front of us, saying, well, you write a report for us. That report became the Music Manifesto. And I wouldn't sign up to it, actually, because
it wasn't what you wanted.
There was no money. Everything was like, which is an attitude which I detest, and I'm sure a lot of you would 100% detest, which is this kind of notion that if you love what you're doing, you shouldn't get paid for it, right?
Yes, I'm sure people will identify with that.
Yes, and so this thing, okay, you love music, so give to the Labour Party, everyone should be working for this music for nothing, just like everybody, with the whole professional record companies, everything. Let's all get together and solve this problem. But there was no money.
Indeed.
And it actually, the problem didn't really cure itself till I got in with a couple of other people to see Gordon Brown. So that was later.
Right, and was that after the Bolivar prom that had prompted the interest in the Sistema movement, or was that just before that?
It was before.
Right,
and,
so you'd already sown the seed.
Brown was the one, one of possibly his best achievements.
I don't think I've heard that before.
Yeah, who created £332 extra million, ring-fenced for music education. It wasn't under Blair, it was under Brown.
Yeah, how interesting.
But there's an insider story here. We were sitting in number 10 Downing Street, and he was saying, yes, we must put money into music. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it. Great. And I said, it shouldn't be a party political thing. It should be something that is beyond, is above the politics. He didn't like that.
Oh, really? Oh dear.
You could see his face, you know Gordon Brown.
Yes,
his face
very
changed
transparent,
to thunder.
yes, indeed.
And I kind of moved on.
What a shame.
But I did say that.
Because,
And I believe that.
Indeed. But then we had that life-changing day when the Simon Bolivar Orchestra played at the Proms, and suddenly there was a will to actually do something that bottled that effect, and you were the person who stepped up to the plate and said, right, I'm going to do something. So you founded the charity In Harmony, which has now become In Harmony Systema England. Could you just talk a bit about the early days of that and how you got it going?
Yes, there was a big stroke of fortune with that, really. First of all, that I was at the concert in the first place, which was, these don't always happen.
So was I.
But I mean, everyone, I think then they were on the Edinburgh Festival immediately after. So it was an event that even, newspapers took notice of.
Indeed.
It struck an immediate chord with me because I've always believed music should be for everyone. And then you saw the incredible standard that these children were achieving, many of which had come from the poorest possible background.
Indeed.
And so this really, I thought this is something that I really want to get involved with. And there was an element of luck because I was sitting next to, and I've always tried to give her credit for this actually, and she doesn't really take it, which is nice, Vanessa Thorpe, who's the arts editor of The Observer. I was sitting next to her, and I said, we really should be starting something like this here. And she said, oh, well, I'd like to interview you about this. And she put a great big splash about the orchestra and about how I said this, and Andrew Adonis, who was the schools minister, was then in touch with me, saying, okay, money where your mouth is really, do you want to lead it? Yeah. And I said, yes, of course. I never went through a lot of, at that point, Mark Jaffrey was very involved with things. He had been the one who was the kind of champion, I think, of the Music Manifesto. And so he was very involved, and eventually In Harmony began.
In its 3 centres initially. I remember going to the launch of it in Kennington in a school really not that far from Westminster, and thinking this was perhaps just one of the many initiatives that were being started at that time and that might not develop into anything. So it is wonderful to come here today and see these children from other areas of the country coming together and performing the range of repertoire that they have done this afternoon. So it has had more money put into it, hasn't it? And new centres have opened up.
Yes.
But it's still by no means stable financially, the whole scheme.
I think we must remember that the Venezuelan Sistema has been going now for over 35 years. And we're not going to get those kind of results overnight. I absolutely believe that it is right for this country. Some people say, oh, you won't be able to do it here. Why not? There's lots of poor areas in this country, and also poverty isn't just about money, it's about spiritual poverty, and there's some areas that are extremely depressed in England, and some of these Hampstead scribes, I don't think they've been to them. And so I believe that El Sistema, the Sistema approach can absolutely work in this country, and it should be spread. It seems to me the future of music education, because the children are working together and they're from all different backgrounds, and it has a big effect on their families and their schoolwork. I don't know how many reports have to be and surveys have to be undertaken before people will realize that our children have a right to access music. It improves their entire lives, it improves their schoolwork, it improves their future, it improves communities, and I believe in the long run, putting money into In Harmony will save money, because it will save court cases, it will save hospitals maybe, all kinds of situations.
Can you just explain a bit for people who may not know how it works in the areas and how much time is spent by those children who are involved in Harmony and music, and how the different institutions work together to deliver it for them?
I think that, I'm not quite as closely, well, I'm not as closely involved as I was. I chair now the charity system at England. In Harmony is now administrated by the Arts Council. So I know a bit about it. And obviously you've got 6 different programs, and I think they probably work in 6 different ways. But they all meet together regularly, and I think they do map out kind of best practice, I suppose. But they would not all have exactly the same timetables.
No.
For
but
example,
in principle, the schools have much more time devoted to music than they normally would.
Absolutely right.
Including after school time as well.
Yes, and after school time a lot. And I mean, one of the things that has come out is, you know, some children who used to play truant now never do because they're so looking forward to the music at the school. You know, that's just a tiny effect. But yeah, I think the program should be spread. That's my view. And wherever I go to play concerts, people come up and say, I wish we had an In Harmony program here. And there are areas of this country where the music education is not anything like as good as it should be.
When we last talked, you and I, for an article I was doing for Classical Music magazine, you had just had your Arts Council grant confirmed up to, I think, 2018.
Yeah, but we don't know what that grant is.
No, and you were waiting for an addition from the Education Department, and I don't know whether you have received that or not, or
I think that there has been a guarantee of some funding, but what does that mean?
So this means it's very difficult to plan.
Yeah, it makes it actually, I would say, impossible to plan properly. And we really need to get over this hurdle. I mean, I know you want to ask me about the latest,
yes.
What is it, consultation?
A consultation, yes, about whether local authorities should continue to contribute to hubs or not. Now, this is almost bitten us overnight, practically, so I'm not particularly up to speed with that myself.
It's incredibly depressing and somehow not at all surprising. Nothing seems to be joined up. You get good news on one side, bad news on the other. You know, we have failed to establish, I think, as a musical community, we need to be more vocal. We need to absolutely conclusively prove that music is of benefit to children. And then it shouldn't be a party political thing. We shouldn't be in this uncertainty that, you know, oh, what's going to happen in 2015? What's going to happen as a change of government? It should be something that is a right for children. And I don't know quite how we get there.
Indeed.
And as I said, how many surveys we need.
Yes. Could you also say something just about the balance between, in projects like this, music as a social activity and music as an intellectual and academic development activity? What would you say to people who said that projects like In Harmony are not joined up with the musical pathways towards conservatoires like this one and towards the professional stage?
Well, I wouldn't agree with that at all, because you only have to look at the standards in Venezuela to see that any of those children would walk into the conservatoires, I believe. And of course, we're not quite in that position, because In Harmony only goes up to secondary school level, and there is this lack of joining up dots, which has been something that so many people say, and it never really quite gets sorted out.
But do you think that an important part of these projects is bringing children to professional classical concerts, letting them see what the possibilities might be for them, and something that they might otherwise not have encountered at all?
I mean, they love it. I see Nicholas here today, and one of the first times I went to Systema Scotland when it just first started, didn't I? And I remember you bringing a group of children to, it was a rehearsal of the Edinburgh Youth Orchestra, who I believe I was playing with them, I'm pretty sure it was them. And the look on their faces, you know, and especially being allowed into rehearsal and seeing what's really going on, is just terrific. I mean, I was lucky. I was born in a musical family, and I was taken to concerts. And then because I was taken to concerts, I then took myself to the concerts because I got into it, you know. But I needed role models like everybody else. I had the best role model of all time in Rostropovich. I found him because I'd been introduced to the cello, introduced to music. I mean, my worry is with the situation as it is now, even if it might be at the moment slightly better than it certainly was in 2003, is that we're missing a lot of talent.
Yes.
People, I mean, there's one boy, it's ridiculous to single anyone out, there's one boy I'm thinking of in the Lambeth project, who's obviously exceptionally talented, and I'm sure that runs, all of you who are involved within Harmony will know that there are individuals that, they've got something special. And of course, they wouldn't, if this hadn't happened, we would never know.
Indeed. If we can talk a bit more generally, the conference theme is music in the 21st century. How optimistic do you feel about classical music at the moment? Particularly, perhaps, you've been quite outspoken about how the media treat classical music. At the BBC, that may change with Tony Hall's appointment after his background at the Royal Opera House. Classic FM seems to be going from strength to strength. But does this mean that young people are going to be hearing classical music if they're not part of a project like yours?
I wonder if there is fundamentally a problem with the term classical music, because what does it really mean? I mean, I mentioned Philip Glass earlier, right? And then you go back to sort of Monteverdi, and you've got 500-600 years of music, and it's all completely different, and it all gets lumped into this title, which I'm not sure it does it any good. But on the other hand, nobody's yet come up with a better description. And I mean, maybe the description is something to do with some cerebral activity. In other words, but even that sounds like complete rubbish, because you take a small 3-minute miniature, Elgar Chanson de Matin, for example, you're not going to go on too much about cerebral activity. It's just a beautiful little piece. But perhaps there is something in that. There's a kind of intellectual rigor about it, which perhaps, well, there isn't probably in the majority pop rock music. It's a kind of, that is, something that's an expression of joy often. But there's something a little bit extra, but different. Because
people appreciate that when they encounter it unexpectedly at an event like a wedding or at in an advertisement or something like that, but they don't recognise that that's what they're listening to.
Well, yes, that's probably a good thing. I think it comes back to that. I mean, they're not told it's classical music, so therefore they think, oh yeah, I like that.
Yeah, as Susan said earlier, babies, young children, have no preconceptions at all. They listen to anything and will enjoy it. They will respond to a rhythm or to a melody, no matter what kind of music it is.
Infuriates me when I hear people say, oh, you come to classical music later in life. Who said that? I think Tony Blair said, I'm 50 now, perhaps I should start getting into classical music.
It's not,
I mean, it doesn't make sense.
And you've been spending the last few months touring with your wife, promoting your new CD, your Tale of Two Cellos. Is that a new venture for you?
Yes, I mean,
how's that been going?
Well, it's a nice change for me to actually go on stage with somebody else, especially so close to it. It kind of is like half the pressure a bit. It's not just if I go wrong, she could go wrong too. And
how has that been getting different audiences? It's had a lot of publicity in local press. Does that mean people are turning up to who might not come to hear you play a concerto with a big symphony
I'm sure
orchestra?
that's true. But as it worked out, as we finish the tour now, but it was a very kind of children-friendly program. We didn't exactly design it like that, but it came out like that. Everything was pretty short, and there were really no. I think the longest piece was 8 minutes. So, I think that's probably true.
I wondered if anybody had any questions that they wanted to ask, just as we're.
This gentleman is raring.
Yeah.
I just want to go back to one of the points you made earlier on about new music or composers in previous generations being and the school of thought that there's only sort of one way you've got to go about creating new music. Is there an argument at all that actually composers, I'm thinking of people like Pierre Boulez and who take this sort of very, very rigorous and quite serious attitude to composition, are actually, this closed-minded world is actually still creating benefit in a way that is actually more greater than if they're having to kind of compromise their ideas. I'm thinking that, a composer like Britten was probably aware of, he was aware of composers such as Boulez in his own time, and this was having an impact on his music, and whether that knock-on effect actually is more significant than having that a more compromised approach to composition.
Well, it's certainly true that there was a kind of feeling amongst some composers, I think, at one time, that if the audience liked what you'd written, there must be something wrong with it, which I find rather odd. I mean, if you are a communicative artist, you want people to like what you're doing. It seems very odd to me. But, I mean, I do really believe things have changed. There are composers out there now who basically can write what they want. I mean, an example, he wrote something for me, the American Eric Whitacre. He seems to have got some critical acclaim and is writing music which is very much enjoyed by a large number of people. So I think we've got over that now. I really do.
Someone over here.
Yeah.
Did you ever compose, or if you did, what did Andrew do?
I have composed some kind of quite trivial short pieces.
And you've done some of these arrangements for the new CD, haven't you, for yourself?
Yeah, I've done quite a lot of that.
Yeah.
And we just actually arranged 5 Vivaldi double concertos for different instruments for 2 cellos. So I've done a lot of that and a lot of arranging. As for composition, I mean, I've tended to write, very sentimental little ditties. And I actually can tell you, off the record, of course, what Andrew said, which was, this sounds like Catelby. That's pretty bad.
Sand dancing.
Yeah. Pretty damning, yeah. No, Catelby's one of the greats.
Yeah, see. Anybody else? Someone in the middle there?
Sorry, that wasn't very convenient. One of the things I've enjoyed seeing in places like Germany is that you have bandstands everywhere, and you have great numbers of good quality musicians performing regularly on bandstands. So people don't have to go into, people for whom it's not normal necessarily to go to concerts, don't have to go into a concert hall, which may feel very unfamiliar, very uncomfortable. And when music and performance is normal and just part of normal life, I think we've got a really good opportunity to inspire young people, because there's nothing like live music to really inspire young people. And even though you spoke about the fact that you came from a musical family and that's why you found music, somebody brought you into the concert hall, I can't help feeling that we are missing a trick by not having more outdoor and more, I mean, I know the weather is a bit of an issue, but having more outdoor and perhaps more community performances with top quality musicians, so that we could actually inspire more young people. I can't help feeling that could be quite cost effective. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, we used to have that, though, didn't we? We used to have that brass, well, I'm sure we still do have the brass band tradition, but there used to be bandstands around, didn't there?
Yes,
I remember,
indeed,
I know there's one opposite my football club, Lake Norwich. There's an old bandstand there, and probably never used.
Indeed, yeah. Anyone else? Well, oh yes.
I was about to call you Andrew, sorry, Julian. Sorry.
Naughty boy.
I don't know what that happened. How awful. So I was just following with that question. I was just in Albania, and I was working with OM, and we were using music and theatre arts to outreach in various communities. And there's some very poor areas I went to, way poorer than anything I've ever seen here. And one thing they had a great pride of was their national heritage of music and their culture. Despite the poverty, and the children were very, very intelligent, fluent in English already by the age of 10. Do you see, Julian, as looking at some of the stuff you said, having more pride in our musical heritage here, in our folk songs, in where all our musical traditions? Do you feel that that would be something equally important in your work to
I mean, I think that some people, I'm sure, do have pride in that. I mean, you had the composers like Vaughan Williams, Holst, based so much on the folk music tradition. But how do you reinforce that when you have a media which completely ignores one entire section of canon of music? You know, it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, I mentioned the brass band tradition. Has there ever, I mean, I don't know, because I'm not an avid devotee, has there ever been on Coronation Street anyone shown learning a brass band instrument?
Good question.
Has there? I don't know. Well, maybe you're EastEnders people, I don't know. But I mean,
very good point.
If there was, I mean, one episode maybe, but I mean, it's actually part of the way people live. Manchester, it's set, isn't it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I sang loads of folk music in school. Like every morning we would sing some kind of folk songs and stuff like that. But I don't see that much happening now. I think that's sad. But we should be more.
Yeah, I think there should. I think that's a really good idea.
Yes, because you're quite enthusiastic about singing as well, aren't you, despite being primarily an instrumentalist yourself? I mean, the Ball of Our Choir's been over here recently, haven't they? And did you go and see them doing some work?
I didn't see them, but I've seen them in Venezuela, and they're terrific. I mean, and I've seen, it is, you know, you always are told it's such an instrumental activity that goes on out there, but there's all kinds of different music going on. And they do, there's a lot of, especially the very young children, a lot of emphasis on rhythm and with no instruments, you know, and then singing as well. So, yeah, and anything, I mean, you have to have these basic requirements, I think, to develop on an instrument.
Indeed, yeah. So it's having a good musical foundation, whatever you're going to go on to do. Anyone else? I think right down here in the corner.
This is nothing profound, but just to tell the rest of you, I popped out at lunchtime. I had to. And the wonderful sextet who entertained us earlier, having given their arty performance, were out there entertaining the masses outside.
Excellent. Jolly good.
Very good.
Very good to know.
There is no distinction between an arty performance and performance for everybody. It is all for everybody.
Excellent. Well, that seems a very good moment for us to hand it back to Dick, I think.
One more. There seems to be one more over here.
Sorry, Tim.
Thank you. I'd like Julian to comment on your trying to find the word to replace classical music. The panel this morning all referred to classical music, and I really think that we've got to just ban the word classical. That's a comment. That's a. Can you come up cerebral? I don't know.
We'll work on it, shall we? Because I've been doing it too.
It's a difficult one because I think somehow we all know what it means, but yet it's. I don't think it's. How can you describe 600 years of music in the same term?
Indeed.
It's
difficult. Oh yes, sorry.
Could I suggest adult music?
Oh,
well,
I don't
think
then
you
it would
can.
definitely keep people away.
Well, it might intrigue some people, that title, but
I
I mean, Mozart wasn't, you know, and Mendelssohn, come on, 16 when he wrote that octet.
Ooh,
well,
that's what does your 2-year-old think? Is 2 or 3-year-old?
You see, that's a case in point. I mean, I've got a 2.5-year-old daughter, that's why I might look a bit, you know. But she loves music, particularly loved when we were rehearsing the Vivaldi.
Yeah, because it speaks
I think
to
because
her.
they're not told what it is, you know.
Yeah, the lady behind there.
She did actually say the other day.
Just going to say, when we were young, when I was small, it was music.
Yeah.
And then pop music. So it's those other words describing all the other things which should have been there. Music has got
should be all encompassing.
That, you know.
There's a couple. We're getting.
Well,
getting heated now.
You know, my wife is Chinese, and in China now, it is very much the norm for people to be. I mean, it's the normal thing for people to be learning an instrument. They all do, and it just seems extraordinary, really, that We don't.
We don't, yeah. In the middle.
I was just going to say, I think the solution is quite simple, that really just backing up what was just being said, that it's music. We talk about dance, that covers quite a long period of physical display, so music seems to be quite sufficient in my view.
Well, it
so
would be
music,
nice.
Dance.
It would be nice, but you know how the newspapers are. They will give it, you know, they will review everything in tiny little pigeonholes, you know.
Yes, we definitely.
Well, let's have a campaign to call it all music.
And then you have radio stations which will only play this, only play that. You know, it's very hard to get that.
Well, we'll have to get our Classic FM, our media partner, to change their name then, won't we?
I think we've just got time for the one more up behind you.
That's what I was going to say. There's an obvious parallel, theatre, drama, dance. They don't have classical theatre, apart from maybe Greek. They don't seem to have the same problems, so, you know, maybe we could learn something from them.
We need to get back to that.
You have a very good point there. Why are the music critics so split into tiny little areas when you'll get the theatre critic who maybe detests musicals, still sent to review a musical? And maybe, you know, the music critics should actually cover the whole spectrum. Good point.
Yes,
Like
indeed.
that.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Julian. It's
Thanks,
been a pleasure
Tam.
talking
Brilliant.
to you. Nothing more to say. He wants me to stay here.
Now, those of you who've looked at your programme may be wondering why your tea break is at 3:15 and we finished nearly 10 minutes early. It is with the greatest pleasure that I have the announcement to make that Julian Lloyd Webber is the 2014 recipient of the Incorporated Society of Musicians Distinguished Musician Award. Stay there.
I shall say a few more words. First stay here.
Widely regarded as one of the finest musicians of his generation, Julian Lloyd Webber enjoys one of the most creative and successful careers in classical music today. He has premiered more than 60 works for cello, and he has inspired new compositions from many diverse composers. His many recordings have been received with worldwide acclaim. Julian has been the Vice President of the Delius Society for many years, and in recognition of his lifelong devotion to the music of Elgar, he was elected President of the Elgar Society in 2009. Julian Lloyd Webber, as you've already heard, is greatly involved in music education and formed the Music Education Consortium with James Galway and Evelyn Glennie in 2003. And on the 21st of November 2007, the UK government announced that infusion of 332 million for music education, which largely resulted from that successful lobbying by Julian. One key element of this funding was the In Harmony programme, which Julian initiated and which in 2008 the British government invited him to chair. The government-commissioned Henley Review of Music Education in 2011 reported that there is no doubt that in the In Harmony programme they have delivered life-changing experiences. And in 2011, Maestro Jose Antonio Abreu, the founder of El Sistema in Venezuela, also recognised In Harmony as part of the El Sistema worldwide network following a visit to Venezuela by Julian. And then in November 2011, the British government announced it would roll out the In Harmony programme across England by extending funding from the Department for Education and adding further funding from the Arts Council England from 2012 to 2015. Julian is now chair of the Charity Sistema England and, when he is not performing, works tirelessly on behalf of music education for all. Julian, it is with the greatest of pleasure that I wish to present you with the Distinguished Musician Award for 2014. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm hugely honoured by this, particularly as I've seen the list of previous recipients. It's quite scary. It's something to live up to, certainly. I haven't really prepared anything to say. What I would do is perhaps develop a little bit of what we were just talking about. I would like to see in the years to come, in the immediate years to come, the music profession unite as never before. And I suppose by that I mean the classical music profession, although we're not allowed to use that term anymore. But we have to, because there are times, sometimes I feel we're under some kind of attack, particularly in this country, not in all countries. Certainly in the Far East now, music seems to be taken as something that is just there. We don't seem to have that view. Only 2 weeks ago, I gave the last of the international chamber music series in Plymouth. It's a series been running for many years. I gave its last concert. Why? Because the council had not only withdrawn funding, but I was told were being quite obstructive in many ways about the premises where it was going on and all that sort of thing. At the same time, although they would probably tell you the Theatre Royal there is massively successful, with its rock pop tribute shows, always, I don't understand those anyway. That's another, who wants to see somebody pretending they're Roy Orbison? I don't know. Anyway, they do apparently, but the council pour a lot of money into the Theatre Royal. So why is it some kinds of music get support and not classical? So I'd like to really see organisations even that have been rivals before, rival orchestras in London, for example, or people that perhaps, or even musicians who believe they might have been rivals. We must get together and fight these cuts. And not only cuts, we should ensure that our children have music as a birthright. And until that happens, I think our job is not done. And we should be writing to newspapers, we should be coming on Radio 4 today, we should be writing to the local news stations and making a real fuss about things. Because otherwise, I think we're increasingly being seen as this kind of little sort of weird elitist group that don't deserve to be sponsored. And actually, I'm fed up with it. So if there's one thing come out of this, please bully your local media. Thank you very much.